I've been selling dried protein clusters on the lower promenade of Vereth 9 for going on 19 years now. My spot's right at the corner where the three main transit corridors meet, the one they call the gut because everything passes through it eventually. Cargo, migrants, travelers, refugees, everything. So I've seen a lot. I want to say that first, because I don't want anyone thinking I'm the kind of man who overreacts. I've watched wars arrive on this station in the form of silent families with nothing but a bag. I've seen children who didn't cry anymore because they'd forgotten it was an option. I've watched bureaucrats stamp denial forms on people who were bleeding. So I've got a high threshold for what makes me stop and truly notice something. But that morning I noticed. It was the 43rd day of the cold season, which on Vereth 9 means the ventilation systems run at half capacity to conserve thermal output for the upper docking rings. Down in the gut, that translates to a bone-dry cold that gets in through your collar and parks itself behind your ears. It doesn't bite. It just settles, like something uninvited deciding to stay. I was setting up my display rack, clipping the pressure seals on my inventory containers when I heard it. Not a loud sound, almost the opposite. It was a sound trying very hard not to be heard. A kind of breathing, short, controlled, like someone counting breaths deliberately to avoid making noise. I looked up and to the left, toward the sidewall of the Vereth Municipal Orphan Coordination Center, which is a very long official name for what's essentially a squat gray building with a steel door, a buzzer panel, and a sign that's been half peeled by moisture damage for as long as I can remember. And standing there, not knocking, not buzzing, just standing, was a child. I almost didn't recognize her as a child at first. She was small, yes, but the way she held herself, very still, very deliberate, made her seem like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Like she'd calculated the exact amount of physical presence she was allowed to have and stayed strictly within it. She was Vale. I recognized the species because we get a fair number of them through the transit corridors, refugees mostly, from the outer collapse zones. The Vale are thin-boned and pale-scaled, with those wide amber eyes that look almost too large for their faces. Adults are usually graceful, elegant even, but this child, she looked like something that had been wrung out and left to dry. Her scales were dull, not the luminous pale gold you see on healthy Vale, more like old paper, dry, almost flaking at the edges near her jawline. Her coverings, I won't call them clothes, they were just layers of wrapped fabric, were wrong for the cold. Completely wrong. I could see her hands trembling where she held them pressed flat against her sides. She was staring at the door. Just staring at it. She hadn't buzzed yet, hadn't knocked. She was just standing there, and after a moment I understood why. She was working up to it. She was gathering something, courage, maybe, or just the particular kind of steadiness you need when you already know the odds aren't in your favor. She pressed the buzzer. There was a long pause. The kind that isn't accidental, the kind where someone on the other side is aware of the button being pressed and is choosing how long to wait before acknowledging it. A panel slid open. One of those old model intercom units with a speaker grill that distorts everything into a kind of flat, impatient buzz. The voice that came out was Orathi, a mid-tier administrative species, very common in station bureaucracy. The tone was immediately recognizable. Not hostile, worse than hostile, procedurally disinterested. Designation and origin of inquiry. The child, I found out later her name was Velindra, but she was going by a shortened version, Vale, or sometimes just Vel. She answered in a small, very careful voice. I am Velindra Keth-Salyun. I have no guardian registered. I was told to come here. I was told this is where children without guardians go. There was a pause, a typing sound, then. Species classification. Vale subclade Salyun, outer ring registered. Another pause, longer. We are currently at capacity for non-coalition primary species. Vale classification falls under auxiliary status. Auxiliary intake is suspended pending budget reallocation from the Sector Council. You may register on the auxiliary waitlist via the public terminal at Corridor Junction B14. I watched the child take that in. She didn't react right away. She stood very still, the way people do when they're trying to process information their brain doesn't want to accept. Then quietly, "How long is the wait list?" "Current projected processing time is 14 to 22 months. She didn't say anything to that. The panel slid closed. And she just stood there, in front of the closed door, in the dry cold, with her wrapped fabric coverings that weren't enough and her dull scales and her hands that were still trying not to shake. I set down my pressure seal tool. I don't know exactly what I was planning to do. Give her something hot to eat, maybe. Point her toward the public shelter listings. Something small and practical that would let me feel like I'd done something without actually having to do anything complicated. But before I crossed the promenade, before I even took 3 full steps, I stopped. Because someone else had already noticed. Section II, Filed Testimony Witness Account 2. Witness Designation, Priya Sandhu. Species Human. Occupation, Civilian Logistics Coordinator, Vareth 9 Midring Supply Hub. Interview conducted, Coalition Archive Office, Vareth 9. Transcript begins. People keep asking me what I was thinking in that moment, what was going through my head, and I keep trying to give them the honest answer, which is, not much. I wasn't having some profound internal monologue. I wasn't calculating outcomes or weighing moral frameworks. I was just there, and she was there, and something didn't add up. I want to back up a little and explain what I was even doing on that side of the promenade, because it matters for context. I'm a logistics coordinator. My job is essentially making sure that supply shipments match their manifests, that what's supposed to arrive actually arrives, and that what's supposed to be distributed actually gets to where it's going, and not into someone's private cargo bay 3 levels up. It's not glamorous work. It involves a lot of walking, a lot of terminal screens, a lot of conversations with people who would rather I wasn't asking questions. That morning I was cutting through the lower gut because the main mid-ring transit was blocked. Some kind of ceremonial procession for one of the coalition ambassador delegations, which means the corridors fill up with banner carriers and an entourage the size of a small army, and trying to walk through it with a data tablet and a deadline is basically impossible. So I cut through the lower gut. I was distracted, I'll admit that. I had a manifest discrepancy from the previous shift rattling around in my head, a protein synthesis shipment that was showing 14 units short, and I had 3 different people each insisting it wasn't their fault. So I was walking and thinking, and not really looking at anything except the floor in front of me. And then something caught my eye. I can't fully explain it, I've tried. It was the stillness, I think. In the gut, everything moves. It's a transit corridor, the whole point of it is movement. Cargo people, automated delivery units weaving between foot traffic. Everything is in motion at all times. But this child was standing completely still in front of a door, and the door was closed. And there was something about the combination of those things, the stillness, the closed door, the child's posture, that made my brain flag it as wrong before I'd consciously processed what I was looking at. I stopped. I watched for a second. She wasn't moving, wasn't leaving, just standing there in front of the closed door with her hands pressed flat against her sides, staring at it like she was deciding something. I'm human. I've lived on Vareth 9 for going on 6 years. I know that humans aren't exactly at the top of anyone's preferred interaction list out here. We're newcomers to the coalition. We're loud. We do things differently. We make decisions that seem irrational by most galactic standards. I know how the social math works. A human approaching a veiled child who clearly wants to be invisible is not automatically a welcome intervention. But I also know what it looks like when a child has nowhere to go. I know that look because I was a social worker in Amritsar for 4 years before the Galactic Integration Program selected me for the off-world placement. I know how a child holds their body when they've already been told no too many times. The particular way the shoulders curve inward. The way the eyes go very careful, very neutral, because hope is something they can't afford to have visibly on their face anymore. This child had that, every bit of it. I watched her press the buzzer. I watched the panel open. I was too far away to hear the exchange clearly, but I heard the tone of the voice that came out of the speaker, that flat, procedural, utterly indifferent tone, and I saw the way the child's body reacted to it. She didn't collapse, she didn't cry. She just went smaller, like something inside her quietly folded up. And the panel slid shut. I was moving before I'd made a conscious decision to move. I crossed the promenade at a pace that I'm told, by Thavan the vendor who apparently watched the whole thing, looked like someone who had decided something and wasn't interested in discussing it, which is probably accurate. I stopped a few feet from her, enough distance that I wasn't crowding her, wasn't looming, because I'm aware that a full-grown human suddenly appearing close to a small child who is already frightened is not a reassuring experience. She heard me stop, her head turned. Up close, she was younger than I'd first thought, maybe 6 or 7 galactic standard years, which translates to somewhere around 8 or 9 in human age equivalents, though Vale developed differently. Her eyes were that characteristic Vale amber, but they'd gone very dark, pupils dilated wide, the way eyes do in low light or high stress. She was assessing me. I could see it happening, running me through whatever internal threat evaluation process a child who has survived outer ring collapse zones builds up over time. I stayed still, kept my hands visible, didn't smile too wide because I've learned that a full human smile with all the teeth showing reads as threatening to about 40% of the non-human species I interact with regularly. I said, "Was that the intake office?" She nodded, once very small. I said, "They told you there was a wait list." Not a question. She must have heard that because something in her expression shifted just slightly. Like she'd recalibrated her read of me. "Yes," she said, 14 to 22 months. Her galactic standard was very good, precise, the way it gets when a child has learned a language out of necessity rather than comfort, when every word matters because you can't afford to be misunderstood. I said, "Where are you sleeping right now?" A pause, then, different places. The thermal exchange alcoves when they're not locked. The cargo staging area at Junction 7 when the night shift coordinator forgets to engage the lock. I asked her how long. She thought about it, like she was genuinely calculating. 41 days, she said. Since she stopped, reorganized, since I came alone. I did the math on that without needing to think very hard. 41 days in the gut in the cold season, with no registered guardian, in thermal exchange alcoves and unlocked cargo bays. At somewhere around 8 or 9 years old. Vale physiology doesn't tolerate sustained cold well. Their metabolism runs slower, and their thermoregulatory system needs consistent warmth to function properly. She'd been in here 41 days, and she was still standing up, still speaking in precise, careful sentences, still assessing me with those dark amber eyes like she hadn't yet given up on the possibility that something might turn out differently. That's when it hit me, not dramatically, not like a wave, more like a door opening in a room I'd been standing next to for years. I said, "I have a room, it's small. The heating system is not perfect. It runs about 2 degrees cold in the main space and 2 degrees warm near the water unit, so it evens out if you stand in the middle. I have food. I have a spare sleeping arrangement. It's not much." She looked at me. I said, I'm not asking you to decide anything permanent right now. I'm asking if you want to not be cold tonight. There was a silence that felt much longer than it probably was. Then she said, "Why?" And I said the only honest thing I had. Because it's a 41-day answer to a question that shouldn't have taken more than 1 day to answer. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at my face, really looked at it, the way children do when they're trying to decide if they're being told the truth. Then she said, "My name is Velindra." And I said, "I'm Priya. Do you like warm food? I can make something from the synthesizer that's not completely terrible." And something happened at the edges of her expression, something small and careful, not quite a smile, but the shape of one maybe, the memory of what one felt like. She said, "Yes." And we walked back through the gut together, and the cold settled around us, and it felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly, it felt like something had been slightly corrected, like a very small thing had gone right in a world that had mostly been going wrong. I want to be clear that my office operated strictly within established coalition policy guidelines. The Vale Child File Designation Kethsalyun, Velindra, was an auxiliary status applicant under Category 7 of the Non-Primary Species Intake Protocol. The protocol is clear. Capacity is allocated first to coalition primary species, then to treaty-recognized species, then to auxiliary status species on a funded availability basis. At the time of the child's inquiry, we had no funded auxiliary intake slots available. The wait list was accurate. 14 to 22 months was the correct projected range based on current sector council budget allocation schedules. I did what the protocol required. I want that understood. I also want it understood that I did not know, at the time, that the child had been sleeping in thermal alcoves for 41 days. That information was not present in the inquiry exchange, had I known. Pause in transcript, approximately 7 seconds. Had I known, I am not certain what options I would have had within the existing protocol structure. The funding constraints were real. The capacity limits were real. But I would have asked different questions. I would have looked at the file differently. The child was 6 galactic standard years of age. The gut in cold season is not a survivable environment for an unaccompanied Vale juvenile without consistent thermal support. I know Vale physiology. I know that. Second pause, approximately 4 seconds. I did what the protocol required. I want that on record. I also want it on record that I have since submitted a formal request for protocol revision to the Sector Council, specifically requesting an emergency intake provision for unaccompanied auxiliary status juveniles below age 10, regardless of capacity status. The request has been pending for 8 months. I check its status every week. Section IV, Archival Notation. Compiled by Senior Archivist Diyen Murukwelesh. The administrative record of the Verath Municipal Orphan Coordination Center for the 43rd day of the cold season, year 2279 GS, shows no filed exception request for Velindra Kethsalyun. The waitlist registration terminal at Corridor Junction B14 received no registration from the child that day. Station surveillance records, preserved as part of this archive, confirm the following sequence of events. 08-14-33, Velindra Kethsalyun approaches the intake door of the Verath Municipal Orphan Coordination Center. 08-14-47, buzzer engagement. 08-15-02, intercom panel opens. 08-15-43, intercom panel closes. Priya Sandhu, human. Coalition Logistics Registry, ID H7742, approaches from the Eastern Promenade. 08-16-09, Sandhu stops approximately 1.4 meters from the child. Exchange ends. Both individuals proceed westward along the lower promenade. Thavan Auric, Velhari, observes their departure from his market stall position. End surveillance notation. The archive records no further interaction between the child and the Verath Municipal Orphan Coordination Center on that date. I got the notification about 6 days after the incident at the orphanage door. It came through the standard residential amendment channel, a request to add a dependent to an existing single-occupancy unit registration. Unit 4 Corridor G, registered to one Priya Sandhu, human, logistics coordinator. Now I want to be honest with you. When I saw the name Sandhu and the species marker, human, I assumed it was an administrative error. Humans on Verath 9 don't typically request dependent amendments. They're mostly here on work contracts, single individuals, temporary placements. The residential structures aren't really designed for families. And the ones who do bring family usually go through the colony placement program, which routes them to the upper residential rings. So I flagged it as a potential error and sent a standard verification request. What came back was not an error. Sandhu had filed a temporary emergency guardianship application through the Intercoalition Social Welfare Bureau, citing immediate welfare necessity under Clause 7 of the Galactic Child Protection Compact, specifically the emergency shelter provision, which allows any registered coalition citizen to apply for temporary guardianship of an unaccompanied minor if they can demonstrate adequate housing, income stability, and no criminal record, and if the application is reviewed within 72 hours. I pulled the application. It was thorough. It was very thorough. She'd attached her income records for the past 3 years, her residential inspection history, character references from her supervisors and 2 Velhari colleagues, a medical assessment she'd apparently gotten from the station clinic confirming the child was malnourished and showing signs of prolonged cold exposure, and a personal statement that Look, I process a lot of paperwork, thousands of residential amendments a year. Most of it runs together after a while, but I still have that personal statement. I've read it more times than I should probably admit to an official archive. She wrote, I am not a licensed care provider. I am not a trained foster placement. I am a logistics coordinator who found a child standing in front of a closed door in 41-day cold, and I am not able to file the correct paperwork for that experience. I can only tell you that she ate 2 bowls of synthesized grain soup and slept for 14 hours, and that when she woke up she asked me, very quietly, if the heating system would stay on. I told her it would. She nodded and went back to sleep. I would like to be the person who keeps that promise. I approved the temporary emergency guardianship within 36 hours. It was the fastest I've processed anything in 11 years. I also sent the application forward to the sector social welfare office with a personal note recommending expedited permanent review. That's outside my standard protocol jurisdiction. I did it anyway. The child presented on the 44th day of the cold season, brought in by the human woman, Sandhu, who identified herself as the child's temporary guardian. She was upfront about the fact that formal paperwork hadn't cleared yet, and offered to pay out of pocket for the assessment if the clinic's indigent care fund couldn't cover a pending guardianship case. We covered it from the fund. I want that clear. Clinically, the child, Vailindra, was significantly underweight for her age and species baseline. Her core temperature was 1.4 degrees below optimal Vail range. She showed early-stage scale desiccation, which in Vail juveniles is a marker of chronic dehydration and insufficient caloric intake. Her peripheral nerve response was slightly sluggish, which we see with prolonged cold exposure in this species. None of it was irreversible. She was malnourished and stressed and cold, but she was functional and her cognition was intact. Given another few weeks in the gut without shelter, I don't know. Cold season doesn't end for another 2 months. I prescribed a nutritional supplement regimen, a thermal adjustment protocol, basically a schedule for gradual rewarming rather than sudden temperature shifts, which can cause systemic shock in Vail, and a follow-up in 10 days. When I told the child what I was prescribing, I expected some resistance. Children her age in her situation often develop distrust of medical intervention. It's been used to process them, categorize them, decide their fate. They don't always want more hands on them. She looked at me very carefully and asked, "Will the supplements taste bad?" I told her honestly that the nutritional ones were fairly neutral, but the thermal regulators had a slightly bitter edge. She said, "Okay, I can do bitter." Something about how she said it, "I can do bitter," not with bravado, just matter-of-factly, like she'd already made the calculation that this was worth it and she was prepared to follow through. I looked at Sandhu, and she was looking at the child with an expression I recognized from parents. From people who have just understood something about a child that they didn't understand before, and the understanding has settled into them, somewhere they weren't expecting it to go. I scheduled the follow-up. I noted in the file that I wanted to be the attending physician at all future appointments for this patient. That's also outside my standard protocol. I did it anyway. Day 1. She slept for 14 hours. I know because I kept checking. Not in a hovering way, I hope not in a hovering way, but just, you know how you check on something you're responsible for, how you listen for the sound of continued existence. Like that. The heating system made its usual complaining noise at about the 3rd hour of the night cycle. I was on my feet before I was fully awake, already moving toward the main room, because I was terrified that the sound had woken her and that she'd think the heat was going off. But she slept through it. I stood there in the dark for a minute, listening to her breathe, and then I went back to my sleeping area and stared at the ceiling until the day cycle started. I don't know what I'm doing. Day 2. She woke up and said good morning in 4 different languages, like she was sampling them, seeing which one I responded to best. I said good morning back in English, and she filed that information away with a small nod, like she was updating a mental document. She asked me what my work was. I explained logistics coordination. She thought about it for a while and then asked if that meant I was responsible for making sure things went where they were supposed to go. I said yes, approximately. She nodded again and said, "That seems important. If things go to the wrong place, the right place doesn't get them." I did not expect to have a logistical philosophy discussion with a 6-year-old over synthesized grain soup at 700 hours, but here we are. Day 3. She asked about the family photograph on the wall unit, the one of my parents' farm in Punjab, the mustard fields in February, that particular yellow that doesn't look real in photographs. I told her it was from my home world. She'd heard of Earth, but only in the context of coalition integration updates. She didn't have much personal reference. I tried to describe Punjab, the smell of the fields in winter, the specific quality of the light in the morning through the fog, the sound of my mother's kitchen. She listened with her full attention, the kind children give when they're genuinely constructing an image, not just being polite. Then she said, "My home had a sound too. It was a kind of wind that came through the rock formations at night. It made a low note. My mother said the rocks were singing." She said it very calmly, present tense becoming past tense mid-sentence, and she handled the transition without flinching, which made me understand how many times she'd already had to do that particular adjustment. I asked if she wanted to talk about her mother. She said, "Not yet. But eventually, I think I will." I said, "Whenever, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me sideways, that amber-eyed, careful look, and said, "You don't know that." Fair point, kid, fair point. Day 5. The temporary guardianship approved. I told her over dinner. She went very still the way she does when she's processing something significant. Then she asked what temporary meant in practical terms. I explained the timeline, 60 days, with a formal review at 30, and permanent placement proceedings beginning at 60 if both parties consented and the welfare assessment was favorable. She asked what happened if the welfare assessment wasn't favorable. I said I intended to make sure it was favorable. She said, but what if it's not? I said, then I will fight it. She thought about that. Then, have you fought official decisions before? I spent 4 years telling bureaucrats their systems were wrong. I have some practice. Did you win? Not always, but enough times to know it's worth trying. She ate 3 more spoonfuls of soup. Then, okay. I don't know exactly what okay covered. A lot of things, I think. Day 7. She started helping me with logistics problems. I don't mean she asked to. I mean I was going over a manifest discrepancy on my tablet at the work table, and she wandered over and looked at the numbers upside down for about 30 seconds and then said, "Your column 3 totals don't match your column 7 inputs." Someone subtracted before applying the transit adjustment coefficient. I stared at her. She looked mildly uncertain, the first time she'd looked uncertain about anything she'd said. She said I might be wrong. She was not wrong. I asked where she'd learned manifest accounting. She said on the Outer Ring colony there had been a man who kept all the supply records, and she'd watched him work because the numbers made a kind of sense that felt reliable when other things didn't. Numbers don't change depending on who's asking, she said. They're the same for everyone. I think I might be slightly outclassed in my own home. Day 9. She had a nightmare. I heard her from the main room, not screaming, just that rapid, shallow breathing that's its own kind of alarm. I went in and crouched near her sleeping arrangement without touching her, just said her name quietly. She woke up fast, eyes open, fully alert, hand moving to the side like she was reaching for something she'd stopped carrying. She looked at me, looked at the room, did the calibration. Then I forgot where I was. That's okay, you're here, heat's on. She sat up, pulled the thermal blanket around herself. After a moment, the dream was about before. I didn't ask what before contained. I just sat on the floor near her sleeping arrangement, and we were quiet for a while. Eventually she said, "My mother got sick very fast. The Outer Ring collapse made the medical supply routes unstable. By the time anything came through that could have." She stopped. Reorganized. She made sure I got on the transit before the final systems failure. She told me to go to the station and find the coordination center. She said they would help. She said it without tears. Not because she wasn't sad, I could see the sadness sitting in her, solid and old, like a stone she'd learned to carry. But she'd already processed this enough times to report it without falling apart. That is not a thing a child should have to learn. I didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Your mother sounds like she was very smart." Yes, a pause. She was also funny. She made jokes about the rocks singing. She pretended the wind sounds were different songs and gave them ridiculous names. And then carefully, like she was testing whether it was allowed, she smiled. Small, real. The first one I'd seen that reached her eyes. I said, "Tell me one of the songs." And she did. She made up words in Vale and translated them into hilariously bad galactic standard, and we sat on the floor in the warm room at 3 in the morning and laughed at her mother's ridiculous Windrock songs until we were both a little out of breath. I think that was the night something shifted, from 2 people in proximity to something more like a unit. I can't define it more precisely than that. I just know something changed. Day 12. She asked me today if humans felt like they belonged in the galaxy. I thought about it honestly before answering. I said, most of the time, no. We arrived late and loud, and we do a lot of things that confuse or irritate other species. We get a lot of looks that say, "Why are you here, and could you be slightly less of yourself about it?" She said, "I know that look." "I know you do." Does it stop? Sometimes, when you find the places and people where you're actually wanted rather than just tolerated, it stops feeling like a look aimed at you and starts feeling like their problem. She thought about that. Is this one of those places, she gestured vaguely at the room, where it stops? I'm hoping it can be, I said, for both of us. Day 14. She asked me to teach her what mustard fields smell like. I said I couldn't exactly transport the smell, but I could try to describe it. She said she wanted to try to imagine it accurately, not just approximately. She wanted a reliable image. So I spent 40 minutes describing the smell of winter mustard fields in Punjab, the green sharp edge of it, the cold underneath it, the way it gets stronger in the fog, while she sat across the table with her eyes closed and her brow slightly furrowed, constructing it. At the end, she opened her eyes and said, I think I have it. I'll tell you if I constructed it wrong when we get there. When we get there, future tense, unprompted. I had to look at my tablet screen for a minute so she wouldn't see my face. The permanent guardianship application crossed my desk during a week that was, I'll be candid, already an administrative catastrophe. The sector council had just issued 3 new austerity directives affecting the social welfare budget. I had 14 active cases in appeal, and my assistant had just transferred to the upper rings without adequate notice. So my first read of the Sandhuketh Salyun file was fast, too fast, I'll admit that. What flagged my attention was the species combination. Human guardian, Vale ward. Neither species has a deep traditional connection in the coalition social structure. Humans are newcomers, full galactic citizenship only 31 years established, and the Vale are an auxiliary status species with complex diplomatic history in Sector 7. The combination was unusual. Now, I want to be very precise here, because I know this archive is going to be read by people who will be looking for places to assign fault. So let me be precise. My hesitation in the initial review was not personal bias against either species. My hesitation was procedural. The Permanent Guardianship Code for cross-species placements has specific cultural integration requirements. The guardian must demonstrate knowledge of and commitment to the ward's species-specific developmental needs, cultural heritage preservation, and biological care requirements. Those requirements exist for very good reasons. They've prevented placements that looked good on paper and turned out to be actively harmful. I scheduled a formal review hearing. What happened at that hearing was... Pause. I've been doing this work for 27 years. I've sat in a lot of review hearings. Some are perfunctory. Some are genuinely difficult. Some are hearings where you're essentially deciding whether a document should reflect what is already obviously true. This was the last kind. Sandhu came prepared. I mean that with full respect. She came prepared in a way that I have rarely seen in a non-professional applicant. She had documentation of the child's medical progress, nutritional recovery, and behavioral assessments from the clinic's attending physician. She had statements from 3 neighbors in her residential corridor attesting to the stability and quality of the living environment. She had a school enrollment plan for the following academic cycle, already coordinated with the station's multi-species educational center, including a note from the education director, confirming that a Vale cultural integration module was available. She had, I am not exaggerating, a 3-page breakdown of Vale juvenile thermoregulatory needs and how her unit's heating system had been modified. She'd contracted a maintenance tech at her own expense to better match the species-appropriate temperature range. She had read the cultural integration requirements in the code, and she had addressed every single one before I asked about them. When I pointed that out, that she'd anticipated requirements most applicants need to be prompted through, she said, I read the code. These are reasonable things. A child shouldn't have to explain why she deserves them. I asked her what her long-term plan was. If the permanent placement was approved, what was her vision for Vailindra's future? She said, she's going to grow up knowing where she came from and knowing where she belongs. She's going to know what Vale Rockwind songs sound like, and she's also going to know what Punjab mustard fields smell like in February. She's going to be somebody's child, and she's going to know that. That's the plan. I asked her if she understood that this was a significant long-term commitment that would affect her career trajectory, her living situation, her social life, and her personal future prospects. She said yes. I thought about it very carefully. I said, and? She said, it wasn't actually that complicated a decision. She was standing outside a closed door. I was the person who saw her. That's the whole logic. Everything else is paperwork. Pause in transcript, approximately 9 seconds. I approved the permanent placement application at the conclusion of the hearing. I also flagged the file for the Sector Council's Social Welfare Reform Committee as a case study in auxiliary species, intake failure and emergency protocol gap. Specifically, the 41-day window during which the child was unregistered in any system while actively present on the station. I wrote in the flag, this child should have been in a warm room on day 1. She was in a warm room on day 42 because a human logistics coordinator took a different route to work. We should not be relying on rerouted commutes as our child welfare safety net. That flag is still sitting in the committee's review queue. I check it monthly. Section IX, Archival Notation. Compiled by Senior Archivist Dian Muruquelesh. The formal permanent guardianship of Vailindra Kethsalyun by Priya Sandhu was approved and registered in the Coalition Social Welfare Registry on the 91st day of the cold season, year 2279 GS. The notice was transmitted to the Varath 9 Residential Housing Registry, the Station Medical Center, and the Multi-Species Education Center for Student Enrollment Processing. A standard notification was also transmitted to the Varath Municipal Orphan Coordination Center, logging the removal of Vailindra Kethsalyun from the auxiliary intake waitlist. Station surveillance records confirm that Priya Sandhu and Vailindra Kethsalyun were observed that evening at the Lower Promenade Food Market, purchasing, in the assessment of the market vendor on record, a very large quantity of spiced grain products and what appeared to be, though the vendor was uncertain, the station's only available approximation of something called cardamom. The vendor, when interviewed for this archive, stated, I don't know what cardamom is. The human woman seemed very determined about it. The child helped count the currency. She was very precise. End archival notation. / I want to be upfront about my role in this because it's going to look, well, it's not going to look good. But the archive requested full transparency, and full transparency is what you're going to get. On the 63rd day of the cold season, approximately 3 weeks after the temporary guardianship was approved, but before the permanent ruling, I received a formal complaint filed through the Interspecies Housing Registry. The complaint was submitted by a consortium of 5 upper-ring residential associations, collectively designated the Varath Residential Standards Coalition. The complaint alleged, and I want to read the exact language because it matters, that the temporary placement of a Vale juvenile in a single-occupancy unit in the mid-ring residential corridor represented a potential destabilizing element to the multi-species social equilibrium of the station community, and requested a review of the housing amendment approval. Now, I want to be very precise about this. The complaint did not use explicitly discriminatory language. It was very carefully written. It referenced housing code. It referenced capacity guidelines. It referenced, and this was the part that was technically most actionable, a subclause in the mid-ring residential agreement that states occupants may not house unregistered or provisionally registered dependents in single-occupancy units without residential liaison approval. The housing amendment had already been approved by Councillor Oshry, so the complaint was technically moot on that point. But the filing required a formal response, and because the filing went through my security command rather than the residential office, because the complainants framed it as a community stability concern, it landed on my desk. I reviewed the file, the full file, the medical records, the welfare assessment, the guardianship documentation, the hearing transcript. And then I reviewed the complaint. And then I spent about 45 minutes sitting at my desk, being very honest with myself about what was actually happening here. What was happening here was that a group of Upper Ring residents, who would never in their lives have to sleep in a thermal exchange alcove for 41 days, were using the station's administrative complaint system to object to a child's existence in their general vicinity. Dressed up in housing code language, but that's what it was. I filed the official response. I'm not going to read it verbatim because the archivist has it already. The summary: the complaint had no actionable basis. The housing amendment was lawfully approved. The residential occupancy was in compliance with all relevant codes. The case was closed. I also requested, through my command's formal communication channel, a meeting with the Residential Standards Coalition's consortium representatives. I want to be clear that I did this not because I had any mandate to do it, but because I have 23 years of security work on various coalition stations, and I know what community stability concern complaints turn into when they're not addressed directly. The meeting was brief. I told the consortium representatives, in terms that I've been told were memorable, that the station's security command did not consider the presence of a veiled child in the care of a registered guardian to constitute a stability threat, that any further complaints of this nature would be reviewed for discriminatory intent under Coalition Community Standards Code, and that if any resident of this station directed any form of harassment toward either the child or her guardian, they would find themselves in a conversation with my command that would be significantly less pleasant than this one. The complaint stopped. I'm not proud of needing to have that meeting. That meeting shouldn't have been necessary, but it was necessary, so I had it. What I am, the only thing I'm genuinely satisfied about in my role in this entire situation, is the follow-up. About a week after the meeting, I was doing my standard corridor walk through the lower gut, and I saw the child, Vailindra. She was at the food market with the human woman, Sandhu, and they were arguing, in the very amiable way that people argue when they fundamentally agree, about whether a particular grain product needed more or less of something that I couldn't identify from a distance. The child looked completely different from the surveillance image in the file. Same amber eyes, same still posture. Actually, she carried herself carefully, that didn't change, but her scales had color in them. The gold was coming back. She was gesturing with both hands as she made her point about the grain product, which she clearly felt strongly about. She looked like a child having an ordinary argument about food. I kept walking, didn't stop or introduce myself. It wasn't my moment to be in. But I remember thinking, you do your job right. The things you're protecting don't need to know you exist. That's the whole point. Section XI, Filed Testimony Witness Account 8. The Vale Community Support Network became aware of Vailindra's situation through the standard internetwork notification when the permanent guardianship was approved. Cross-species placements trigger an automatic notification to the relevant cultural liaison offices because, as I'll explain, cultural continuity is a serious concern for Vale children in particular. Vale culture is deeply oral. We don't write things down the way coalition primary species do. Our histories, our traditions, our sense of self, they travel through voice, through story, through specific sounds. The wind songs that the child apparently mentioned to her guardian, those are real. They're called Velith Corn rock breath songs. They're a traditional Vale practice, using the natural resonance of geological formations to mark seasons, events, deaths, births. A Vale child growing up outside Vale community without access to cultural continuity loses access to something that can't be easily reconstructed later. Language drifts. Oral traditions require living transmission to survive. So when the network notified me, I went to meet Sandhu. I want to be transparent about my expectations going in. I've worked with cross-species placements before. The guardians are often well-meaning. They're often genuinely caring, but they don't always understand what they don't know about cultural continuity, and sometimes they resist the network's involvement because they interpret it as a challenge to the placement. Sandhu was not that kind of guardian. She had already reached out to the network before I contacted her. She'd found our contact listing through the Coalition Cultural Registry and sent an inquiry asking if the network had resources in Vale oral tradition, specifically Velith corn practices, and whether there were community elders or practitioners available for periodic engagement with a Vale child in a cross-species household. She said in the inquiry, "I want her to grow up knowing the songs. I don't know the songs. I need help with this part." I've worked in cultural liaison for 16 years. That sentence, "I need help with this part," is rarer than it should be. Most guardians will try to approximate cultural needs on their own and avoid admitting gaps because admitting gaps feels like vulnerability. Sandhu led with the gap. She identified exactly what she didn't know and asked directly for what she needed. We arranged for one of our elder practitioners, a woman named Solvith, who is one of perhaps 12 remaining fluent Velith corn practitioners in Sector 7, to begin monthly sessions with Velindra. I attended the first session. The child knew fragments. She had what her mother had given her in the short years they'd been together, a sense of the practice, some partial songs, but she hadn't had anyone to develop it with since the outer ring collapse. When Solvith began the first teaching, the ground breath call, which is the foundational pattern, Velindra went very still, the way she does when something matters, and then she made the sound back, quietly, testing it. And Solvith corrected the pitch slightly, and the child adjusted, and they went back and forth like that for about 20 minutes. At the end, when Solvith paused, Velindra looked at her and said, in Vale, which I translated for Sandhu, who was sitting across the room trying very hard not to hover. My mother knew this one. She called it the wind-thinking song. Solvith said, "Yes, that's its common name. Its formal name is the Vel Morth, the remembering breath. We sing it when we want to remember someone who has gone ahead." Velindra nodded, thought about that. Then, "I want to know all of it, the complete one." Solvith said, "That will take time." "I have time now." I looked at Sandhu. Sandhu was looking at the child with that expression again. The one I'd been told about by the clinic doctor, the one that doesn't have a clean word for it in most languages. Parental pride, maybe, mixed with a kind of tenderness and a kind of grief for the child's past, and a kind of forward-facing something that's hard to name. The sessions continued monthly. They continue to this day. She arrived mid-cycle, which is always difficult for integration. The social structures in the classes are already established. The children know each other. An arrival mid-cycle is immediately visible as different, which children, across most of the species I work with, a process with varying degrees of grace. I was prepared for a difficult integration period. What I was not prepared for was Velindra. She sat in the third row on her first day, chose the seat deliberately. I watched her survey the room and make a calculated decision. Third row, near the aisle, with clear sightlines to the two exits. That's not a coincidence. That's a child who has been in uncertain spaces long enough to know where she wants to be in relation to the doors. I didn't draw attention to her placement. I just noted it. In the first week, she said almost nothing in group sessions. She observed, listened. I could tell she was processing, not shutting down. There's a difference, and the difference is what the eyes are doing. Her eyes were tracking, noting, filing. She was building a model. In the second week, Another student, a Velhari boy named Torvin, who I love dearly and who has the specific social grace of a malfunctioning cargo loader, asked her, very directly and without preamble, why her scales looked different from other Vale he'd seen on the promenade. The class went quiet. A few students looked uncomfortable. I was already calculating my intervention response. Vailendra looked at Torvin for a moment, then said, "They were dull because I was cold and not eating enough for a while. They come back when you're healthy. Mine are mostly back now." Torvin said, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. My leg scales go dull when I forget to hydrate." "Yes," she said, "similar biology." And that was that. Torvin, to his credit, had asked a question that many of the other children were probably wondering about, and the answer was given in such a matter-of-fact way that there was nothing left for anyone to be uncomfortable about. Vailendra had handled a potentially isolating moment by treating it as a logistics problem and solving it. By the fourth week, she and Torvin were arguing about calculation methods for orbital trajectory problems. She was right, as it turned out, though Torvin took another 3 days to fully accept this. By the end of the cycle, she was the person other students came to when they had questions about how to approach a problem they didn't understand yet. I'll tell you the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about that class. About 6 weeks in, we had a session on families. It's part of the social integration curriculum. Students share something about their home lives, their backgrounds, the adults they live with. It's usually pleasant and sometimes complicated. When it was Vailendra's turn, she said, "I live with my guardian, Priya. She's human. She's a logistics coordinator, which means she makes sure things go to the right places. We have a heating system that runs 2 degrees cold on one side and 2 degrees warm on the other. We eat a lot of grain soup. She's teaching me about a place called Punjab, which has fields that smell like green and cold mixed together. And I'm teaching her the Vale Morth, the Vale Remembering Breath song. She's not very good at it yet, but she's trying very hard." She said it the way she said most things, careful, precise, no extra words. But at the end there was that small something at the corners of her expression. The memory of a smile turned into the real thing. A student in the second row asked, "What's a Remembering Breath song?" And Vailendra said, "It's how we remember the people we've lost. You breathe it when you want to tell them you still know they existed." The room was very quiet. "Then I can teach you a small part of it if you want." And she did. She taught a room full of 9 and 10-year-olds of 5 different species, a fragment of a Velith corn practice that is known to fewer than 12 living practitioners. I have been teaching for 14 years. I do not think I will forget that session. I see them every few weeks. They come through the gut on their way to the cultural center. The Vale Elder has sessions there now, I think, and sometimes they stop at my stall after. The kid likes my dried protein clusters better than she lets on. She's very precise about everything, including how much she enjoys things, which I've learned means she's not going to just come right out and say something is good. She'll make a small specific comment about a particular quality of it, the texture, or the flavoring balance, which is her version of a compliment. She told me last month that the protein clusters have a satisfactory mineral profile. Coming from her, I'm putting that on my signage. The woman Sandhu, she always stops and talks. She's good at that. Good at actually talking to people in the gut, not through them. You get a lot of transit traffic that looks at the market like it's scenery. She talks like she's genuinely interested in what you're doing and what you know, which is its own kind of gift. Last time they came through, the kid was telling Sandhu something in Vale, a longer sentence, complicated sounding. And Sandhu was listening with that particular human look of intense concentration, and then she responded in what was clearly very bad Vale, and the kid stopped and said, with great patience, "The breath pattern was wrong. You're making it sound like an insult." "What did it sound like?" I said. The kid told her. Sandhu made a face. The kid laughed. I don't look. I've been in this market for 19 years. I've watched a lot of hard things move through this corridor. The gut doesn't always have good endings. Most of what passes through here is just people trying to get somewhere and hoping it's better when they arrive. But sometimes you get to watch one of the endings turn out right. She was standing in front of that closed door with nothing. 41 days of nothing. And then this woman took a different route to work one morning, and now she's laughing about verb conjugations in the promenade. I don't have a way to explain what the galaxy is exactly. I don't think anyone does. But I know what it felt like to watch that happen. It felt like something correct, like something that had been at the wrong angle finally lined up. That's all I can say about it. Sometimes the best things don't need more words than that. She won the orbital calculation competition at the Education Center this morning. Regional level. First Vale student in Verath 9 educational history to place in the regional finals, which is a thing I'm apparently allowed to be embarrassingly proud of, because I told 4 people at work within the first hour, and I'm not even slightly sorry about it. She handled the prize ceremony with great composure, and exactly one moment of completely unguarded joy when they announced her name. This flash of something on her face that I suspect will be seared onto my brain until I die. And then she immediately reassembled herself into the composed, precise, slightly intense person she usually is. On the way home, she said, the second-place finisher used a valid calculation method. He just applied the wrong coefficient for the reference frame. It was a small error. I said, you still won. Yes, but it was a small error. It could happen to anyone. Are you being generous to him or explaining why he shouldn't feel bad? She thought about it. Both. I also want to be accurate. I said, that is extremely you. She looked sideways at me with those amber eyes, darker at the center now, healthy, clear. Her scales have been back to full gold for months. She's taller. She grew 3 centimeters in the last season cycle, and she tracked it with a level of scientific interest that I can only describe as characteristic. She said, Priya. Yeah. I have been thinking about the mustard fields. We've been planning a visit to Earth for 8 months now, coordinating around my work schedule and her school cycle and the transit window and approximately 10,000 logistical details, which she helps me manage with great enthusiasm. What about them? I have a more complete image now than I did in year 1. I've been refining it. I want to check it against the actual experience when we go. How much of an accurate picture do you think you have? She considered. Perhaps 70%. I'm uncertain about the specific light quality in the fog. Descriptions of light are difficult to construct precisely. And the smell, I have the component notes, but I'm uncertain about the ratio. The ratio, I repeated. How much green to how much cold, in the smell? I thought about my parents' farm. February. The fog burning off by mid-morning. The particular smell of it, she was right that it had a ratio, though I'd never thought to describe it in those terms. I think, I said slowly, it's about 60% green, and then the cold is more like an underneath note, like the green is sitting on top of it. She nodded, making a small internal adjustment. Good, that's useful. You can tell me how close you got when we're standing in it. I will, she said. And then, after a moment, with that careful precision that she applies to everything, I'm looking forward to it very much. Which from her means she can barely wait. I know this because I've learned the language. The specific, careful, precise language of one particular child who came from somewhere very hard and is building something very solid, one accurate data point at a time. I know her, that's the whole thing, I know her. We got home. The heating unit made its usual complaint noise. She made the small sound she makes when she's Mach annoyed at inanimate objects. I made grain soup. She corrected my seasoning ratio, which she always does, and she's always right, which I will never fully admit to her face because the negotiation is its own kind of joy. After dinner, she sat at the work table with her orbital mechanics textbook, and I sat on the other side with my manifests, and we didn't say much for a while. Good quiet, the kind you earn. Outside, Vareth 9 turned through its station cycle. The cold season was ending. The ventilation systems would come back online in another 2 weeks, and the gut would warm up, and another wave of transit travelers would come through, and among them there would be children who needed someone to cross a promenade. I hope they find the right person. I hope the right person doesn't walk the other way. I'm not naive enough to think everyone does what I did. I'm not naive enough to think I would have done it on a different day, under different circumstances, with a different level of distraction. There's an uncomfortable amount of luck in what happened. But it happened, and she's here, and the heat is on. That's enough for tonight.